One of the things we're always asking ourselves, and people ask me as well, is can I do this? Can I find this information? Can I dig out that? And quite often we don't stop to ask ourselves the other important question is should I? Because just because you can do something does not automatically mean it's a good idea to go ahead and do it. So I'm going to talk about it in two separate things. The main one is about your actual investigation technique and procedure. First of all, OSINT, you hear this term being thrown around an awful lot. What is it actually? Well, in its most basic terms, OSINT stands for Open Source Intelligence. Now, the intelligence term is one that there's a bit of definitional argument and dispute about, because if you look for it in the dictionary, it is traditionally associated with military and political spheres. But of course, the internet, I mean, some of you may have seen the Netflix documentary, am I allowed to use the full title? Don't Fuck with Cats, which showed people using a lot of open source techniques. So it's brought increased possibilities to members of the public to be able to do these things. But of course, the military and intelligence environment is, and I say relatively lawless. Of course, they have their ethical rules and standards and whatever, but I think it's fair to say that if they thought something was of use to them, they would be less bound by the same norms that the rest of us are. While that's just a question of definition, there's a lot more argument about open source. What is an open source? I think we can all agree that officially published documents by official bodies are certainly open source. However, there are other situations. So what if these documents were not meant to be made public in the first place? If they were official, but they were not meant to be published? And then things like private citizens, social media, is that off limits? Is it an open field for us? Here's an example of something that you can find very easily using pretty basic techniques. It's a document I just dug out in a few seconds. And you can see at the bottom there, it says private and confidential internal use only, not to be distributed. But they hosted it on their domain and did not leave it covered in any way to stop people like me and you getting hold of it. So is this an open source? There will be agreement and disagreement on this. Then talking about trawling through people's social media. Do you really know how much of your online presence is open to the public? Are you certain about that? Are there things that anybody with a little bit of know-how can find out about you that you would not intend them to find out? Then there are certain things, of course, that are not open source. And any information that you acquire through hacking or otherwise compromising a source, or things that you use deceit, subterfuge, or misrepresentation. So by lying to people, misrepresenting who you are, what your purposes are, I do not think you can classify this as open source. But then, of course, in between these things that obviously are open source and are obviously not open source, there will be questionable practices. Things like email tracking, like using read receipts, tracking pixels, things like that. Then things like publicly naming people. This is becoming quite a common practice, reaching out to the public to say, you know, we suspect this person may have been involved in something, and ending up getting people in all kinds of trouble because you've falsely or mistakenly associated them with something nefarious. So you've got to be very careful in things like that. There have been some terrible cases of people suffering all kinds of trolling and bullying because they were falsely named as being connected with something. And then, of course, there's the thing of trawling through social media accounts. We'll go into a bit more of that shortly. But it's very important because some of these things differ in legal terms across jurisdictions, across countries. And you need to be aware of, for example, some of these email tracking techniques, particularly in Europe under the GDPR, the privacy laws. Some of these things you're not supposed to be doing at all. So it's very important to speak to legal people if you're in a news organization and find out what the relevant local laws are on things like this. Then, of course, in between all these, there will be always gray areas. It's such a multifaceted field that very often you will not be able to put a strict definition on what you're doing. So you will be faced with this question of how far you can go and how far you should go while you're chasing information. Now, I always try to simplify these things as much as I can and bring them down to some kind of a schematic or something that can just kick you off. This is not going to cover 100% of the cases, but here are 3 things that I believe you should consider when you're looking at a gray area and you're wondering, should you do this or not? And I call them need, value, and consequences. Need, first of all, how essential is this piece of information? Do you absolutely need this to do your verification work? If not, and if it's in some kind of a gray area, then I would let well alone. Also, if it is essential, is there another way you can get the information? Do you have to use some kind of questionable practice, or is there another way around it? Use your imagination. It's important. Then in terms of value, if you do this, how important is the information you will get? Is it a matter of public importance, such as a politician engaged in corruption, a major company engaged in corrupt practices, and so on? Or is it simply a picture of some celebrity's kids or something that is just for entertainment or titillation of an audience? You've got to take a look at the value of this. Then finally, the other leg of that triangle I call the consequences. If you acquire the information in this way, what is the potential fallout? It may be, strictly speaking, legal, but if you go ahead and do it, and if the public finds out that you have used this technique, is there a risk to the trust, integrity, and dignity of yourself or your employer? This is very important because you may be able in the end to say, well, I didn't break any laws. But as we know, law, morals, ethics, these things do not always accord directly with each other. So having looked at the side of it involving investigation, the next thing is the use of content. When you do find pieces of information, how do you actually go about using them? This is an attitude that you hear a lot among both media people and tech people, that, hey, it's fair game. Okay, that person didn't mean to publish that, but if they're too dumb or too lazy to understand what they're doing, that's not our problem. And it's a really insidious attitude. It's one that I think we let ourselves down when we use this too much as an argument. And again, it goes back to value. You know, if you are not getting anything other than a couple of funny photographs, which will embarrass somebody, then you really should not be using this kind of justification for yourself. Just think about it yourselves. I'm sure everyone here is using an online service of some kind. And I'm equally sure that not one person who's listening to this reads every word of every terms of service agreement every time they sign up for something. You know these. Some of you may know them as these 5,000 or 10,000 word long screeds of legalese. Others may know them as that thing that you ignore when you click, yes, I agree, or okay, and you move on. And later you go back and you find out that you've agreed to all kinds of things you didn't intend. I'm confident in saying that the public, by and large, do not know everything they have consented to. I'm sure most people do not read these terms and conditions. Another thing is when you are reaching out to members of the public, and this is very similar to the terms and conditions stuff, that I think a lot of places do this in bad faith. Here is the Daily Mail. I have no hesitation in naming them on this because they've been doing this for years, and I called them out on it several years ago. They still do it, where they reach out to people who have valuable content and they say, can we use your footage? Please find our terms here and reply to confirm. Implication that you agree to all these terms. When you click on that, this is what you get. And you can see it's full of legalese. What are affiliates? What is a member of the undertaking? And so on. I'm not sure, looking at this screen, you can see what's at the top of that. That's page 1 of 13 pages. So you have somebody who has just captured something dramatic and they're being asked to agree to 13 pages of legalese jargon. That is not something that has been created in good faith. That is what is known in the industry as a cover your ass agreement. It's just to prevent you later getting back and disputing or suing them. So please don't do things like this to your audience. It's disrespectful. It's unfair. There is a short link there, is.gd/reaching out. That's a link to a blog post that I've written where I've gathered together from about 10 years of experience tips on things that you should take account of when you're reaching out to members of the public, and I hope it's helpful. Then there are what we call the gotcha moments. Very often we'll see on somebody's social media accounts something where someone has posted something that, yeah, it's interesting, it's dramatic. And for example, here you go to the Pope's site and you go into his likes tab, just checking what has the Pope been liking. And apologies for more K-pop references today. I know I had one yesterday that left some people cold. But if you find that the Pope has liked this picture of this young lady, how do you approach it? Do you report it like this? Because the Pope obviously is a big fan of Blackpink, the Korean girl group. Or do you take into consideration that could have been done by accident? I'm sure we've all clicked on things by accident. I know one thing that I do from time to time, I forget I see an Instagram picture and I double tap on it on my phone because I'm trying to zoom. And of course, if you double tap on Instagram, that gives a like instead. And I usually undo it, but sometimes I don't. And then you have to think, was the person in control of their account or device? We had the big Twitter hack a few months ago where apparently Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Elon Musk and other people were boosting Bitcoin, where obviously they weren't. But again, they were not in control of their accounts when these tweets went out. So you've got to be really careful about stuff like this. You can't say because somebody's verified account said something, you can't say that person said it. So big problem, going back to the things at the start where you had these people who did some really skillful work, but then made quite horrible use of it, is that a lot of people now have these OSINT skills, but they don't have the journalistic training or background to know how to handle the resulting information responsibly. That's not the case with most of the people here today. Most of you will have pretty comprehensive training and standards resulting from that. So I would say to you, don't forget that side of the work. It came up in conversation yesterday. We sometimes get overexcited and fetishize fact-checking and verification and debunks and forget that we have to treat all this stuff the same as we've always treated information. And just a quick reminder that when you put on something on your social media and you have your settings to public, you are publishing it. And you have to take the same responsibility with that as you would with any article that goes out with your byline on top of it. So if you find something and you would not put that in a story because you know your editor or your legal people or somebody else would say, that's questionable, don't put it in the story, well then don't put it on Twitter.